one common myth is that humans never learn from history. And one of the most famous people to say something like this was a German philosopher named Hegel. And to paraphrase him, he said something like, the one thing we can learn from history is that humans never learn anything from history. Another way of saying this is that history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. So, in this video, I want to talk about how some big problems can just keep happening over and over and over. And it can seem like people are never learning the lessons they would need to learn to prevent those problems from arising. But I don't just want to complain. I want to talk about what is the deep lesson that people aren't learning, and how could we learn that lesson and actually stop big problems. And lastly, I want to talk about what is a healthy culture like that's able to learn from the past and really put an end to big problems. So, just to pick one big pattern, I want to talk about wars based on lies, right? Where an entire society goes off to war and most people actually believe falsehoods that motivate them to go fight. So, just to give a quick outline before diving into examples, the one reason that authorities and the rich will want to go to war is to get even richer, right? But if someone told me, I'm a rich person and I want to get even richer, and so I want you to risk your life thousands of miles away in a war so that I can get richer, like that wouldn't motivate me. Like I wouldn't feel excited to go fight, to make someone else richer. And the authorities know that, and so what they'll commonly do is they'll make up some other story. They'll say that, oh, they attacked us first, and you need to join the military to protect your people, right? Or they'll say, oh, they molest children, and we need to be the good guys and go over there and protect people from those bad guys, right? And what ends up happening is people build up so much anger and even hatred that when the authorities then give the order to go fight, a lot of people are like chomping at the bit. They're like, what took you so long to order us to go fight those people, right? So I'd like to give a bunch of examples of that happening, and some from where I live in the United States, but also around the world, to show that this is just a pattern that just keeps happening. So one comes from the American entry into World War I, right? A few years earlier, there's a lot of peace activism actually in the United States to keep the U.S. out of that war. And then, unfortunately, a civilian vessel called the Lusitania was sunk by the Germans, right? There were a bunch of Americans on board. There were also, British and people from other countries. And a huge amount of news coverage, public relations coverage that talked about how terrible and bad the Germans were and how totally inappropriate that was. And it got a lot of Americans really mad at those Germans, right, for attacking the civilian boat. Well, it turns out the truth was that the Germans had said clearly, if any vessel, if any boat comes into these European waters carrying military equipment or ammunition of any kind, we will consider it a military vessel and we will sink it. And it turns out the Lusitania had a huge amount of military material on it, right? Unbeknownst to most passengers, it actually had material that would be used to construct explosives or artillery shells. The Brits acknowledged at the time that it had small arms ammunition, like bullets, but they said that's not enough to justify it being considered a military vessel. But the truth is that I believe any country in war would consider that a military vessel, because it was a civilian liner with a huge cargo of war material in it. And so the people that actually put the civilians at risk were the people who put that material in that boat and didn't tell the passengers, right? But the Americans never held those people accountable, right, for putting the passengers at risk. Instead, they got angry at the Germans. And America ended up going into the war. As another example, fast forward to the early 1990s, the U.S. Leadership wanted to go to war in Iraq. And they invited this 15-year-old young woman to testify to Congress. She was a Kuwaiti, and she talked about how the Iraqi soldiers, that Iraq had just invaded Kuwait, a neighboring country in Western Asia. And they had she talked about the Iraqi soldiers, how they went into hospitals and they would rip babies out of incubators and leave the babies to die, right? Totally cruel and vicious. And the U.S. Congress people, the senators and representatives, they kept repeating her testimony to play up how evil and bad the Iraqis were. U.S. President Bush, the first Bush, he talked it up. How bad those people are. We need to be the good guys and go in there and protect, those innocent Kuwaitis, right, from the bad Iraqis. Well, it turns out that story was completely fabricated, right? That 15-year-old was presented as sort of a random citizen of Kuwait, but in reality, she was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S., and she was willing to just straight up lie to Congress, and they were willing to play along with it to get their war. So you ended up having a huge number of Americans who were, in support of that war when it finally happened. And of course, the Americans never held accountable the people who had lied to them. And this is playing out right now. Speaking of history rhyming, the U.S. Is engaged in a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, and has spent huge, like many, many billions of dollars in support of the Ukraine government against the Russian government. And a big reason, like a big way the U.S. government motivated Americans to support this war is by saying that the Russians invaded unprovoked, right? And so America's supposedly just protecting this plucky Ukrainian democracy against the evil Russian dictatorship under Vladimir Putin. That's the story. And that has actually caused a lot of Americans to like put up Ukrainian flags, right? Like, and support the sort of canceling of Russia, right? Canceling a lot of Russian cultural events in the U.S. And in this video, I'm not commenting on the war, right? Or how either side has carried it out. I'm not judging any of that. All I'm acknowledging is that the Russians were not unprovoked. So in 2014, the U.S. actually installed a pro-American, anti-Russian government in Ukraine and spent billions of dollars building up their military in preparation for this proxy war. And so what ended up happening was the Ukrainian government, prior to the Russian invasion, actually launched thousands of artillery shells at their autonomous provinces in the east, right, where a lot of the fighting is now happening. So it turns out the Ukrainians actually fired first, but almost no Americans know that. And that's not just me making that up or the Russians making that up. That actually came from observers from Europe, right? Like war observers were in Ukraine watching it happen, reporting it as it happened, right? But that never actually got into the mainstream press in the United States. And even worse, the Ukrainians actually, like literally weeks before the Russians' invasion, threatened to get nuclear weapons. And any American probably knows about the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviets tried to install nuclear missiles in Cuba in the 1960s. And the Americans had a very strong response to that. There was a naval blockade. They said absolutely not, right? And so the Russians had a similarly strong response, right? We will not tolerate an anti-Russian government right, next to us that has nuclear weapons, right? And so regardless of how either side has engaged in the war, I'm not commenting on that. I'm merely saying that the Russians were not unprovoked. And yet, right, a huge number of Americans are not holding their leadership accountable for lying to them, and instead they're supporting this proxy war. So, these are all examples from America, but this isn't an American problem. It actually is common in a lot of cultures around the world. So to give an example that's not American, shortly before World War II, the Soviets wanted to attack Finland, right, in what later became the Winter War. And the trouble is that the Soviet Union is like gargantuan, right? And Finland is tiny in comparison, right? And the Finnish probably knew better than to just randomly attack the Soviet Union. So what did they do? Well, the Soviets actually had the Soviet military secretly attack a Soviet town close to the border with Finland. And then they blamed the Finnish for the attack. And so the Soviets got to act like they were, acting in self-defense against this relatively tiny country that never attacked them in the first place. And the Finnish are like, what are you talking about? And then all of a sudden the Soviets are coming in. So, I'm laughing about it because it's so ridiculous. But, it was a huge war. Um, in any event, one laughs at history sometimes just to keep one's sanity. Another example comes from Nazi Germany. The Germans wanted to attack Poland in 1939, and the only trouble was that those Polish people weren't attacking Germany, and they definitely weren't attacking on the German schedule. And so, what did they do? Well, the Germans actually secretly attacked their own radio station and then blamed the Polish people. And they said, the Polish people attacked us. And then they went and launched World War II. And they invaded Poland. But pretending that they were protecting themselves from an aggressor when the Polish had never done anything like that. So this isn't just an American problem. It's actually a problem that just keeps happening in lots of cultures around the world. And, there are all kinds of like follow-on effects, right? So you end up having these peace activists who like notice the lies and they'll try and point out the truth to prevent an unnecessary war based on misunderstandings, right? The trouble is that the authorities want the war, the authorities know they're lying, and then so what do? Well, they double down actually, and they'll commonly point out that the activists are the traitors, they're cowards and they're liars, right? To scare the rest of the public into supporting the authorities and not listening to the peace activists. And so that's happening also right now. Speaking of history rhyming, anyone who tries to just acknowledge the reality of the situation with the U.S. and Ukraine and Russia gets called a Russian propagandist, or a Putin lover, as if peace activists have any special affection for the Russian president, when in reality they're just trying to stop an unnecessary war and potentially nuclear war. And this isn't just an American problem. This is also happening, for example, in Germany, where a politician recently, complained actually in their parliament that she'd been called a Putin troll just for trying to speak the truth, right, and acknowledge everyone's perspective. So, yeah, it can really seem that humans never learn from history because these big problems just keep happening. So, what is the deepest lesson? Like, what is the lesson that people aren't learning, and why, and what can be done about it? So, to get to the root of the problem requires talking about healthy and unhealthy cultures, because it's not that humans never learn from the past, it's that unhealthy cultures don't learn from the past. So, I just wrote a free book called One Disease, One Cure. And in this book, I share a lot of my research into unhealthy cultures and healthy cultures. And so, it's very just a normal pattern in unhealthy cultures to have wars based on lies. But in every culture I've ever found that has wars based on lies, that same culture will also have sexism, will also have racism, will also have a few rich and a lot of poor, will also have pollution, right? So in any culture with any one of those big problems, they'll also have all the other of those big problems. And it turns out there are cultures that don't have those problems. They don't go to war based on lies. They don't have sexism. They don't have racism, right? And when I really looked into it, I found one root difference between all of these really unhealthy cultures with these big problems that seem to never go away, and all these healthy cultures that are able to maintain a basically respectful relationship between everyone in the culture indefinitely. And what I discovered is that in these unhealthy cultures, they all share a root cultural disease, where a few people can impose law on everybody else, where a few people can choose how the law is enforced and everyone else just gets to go along with it, which is what it means to have rulers, right? So that's what it means for a few people to rule over everybody else. And that then is the root cultural disease. In every culture where a few people rule over everybody else, they also commonly have wars based on lies. They also commonly call their peace activists traitors and cowards. They also commonly have sexism and racism and pollution and the whole list of problems, which is longer even than the list I've shared so far. There's a lot of problems in these unhealthy cultures that just never seem to go away. And that's because there's a root problem, which is that a few people rule over everybody else. So what would it be like to be in a culture that didn't have this root problem. Um, and where people are actually able to have big problems, learn lessons from them, apply the lessons, and then not have those problems anymore. Which sounds pretty magical to me, right? So I'd like to share a story from a healthy culture called the Haudenosaunee that inspired me and showed me that it is possible for humans to have problems, learn lessons, apply the lessons, and then not have those problems anymore. So the Haudenosaunee are a healthy culture in the area that most Americans would know as New York State, roughly. They currently live under U.S. law, and so which makes it impossible to live in a fully traditional way. But I want to talk about the period before the Europeans arrived and imposed law, and they're able to live in a way that they chose. So, and then the last thing to preface this story is that the story I'm about to tell doesn't come from archaeologists unearthing bone fragments and trying to interpret ashen piles from 1,000 years ago. It actually comes from historians from the Haudenosaunee themselves. So these are people that are basically speaking to their own history as they've remembered it over time. So around 900 years ago, it was a period of a huge amount of warfare in that region. There were several different nations. They were at war with each other, and it seemed endless, right? A huge amount of violence. And to cut a long story very short, the nations came together and they said, you know what? We're tired of this. We would like some peace. And not just a peace like as in a lack of violence, right? Because a lack of violence and peace are not the same. You could put someone in like an isolation cell in prison and no one is actively hitting that inmate, but no one would say that's a peaceful existence, right? Being stuck in a prison cell. So they didn't just want, I believe, they didn't just want a lack of violence. They wanted like an actually satisfying, relaxing peace that could last indefinitely. And so what these historians talk about is how they actually learned from the causes of the violence and made changes that would keep those problems from arising, or if they did arise, they would have a good way of addressing it. To say one more thing before jumping into the examples, the Haudenosaunee is actually a confederacy. It's a collection of nations. And so the confederacy, like the Haudenosaunee, didn't exist during this period of warfare. It was just a bunch of separate nations. And so what they actually did was they created what I would say is a new culture, right? The Haudenosaunee is a confederacy and that has all those nations in it. And so they're all still distinct nations. But then there's this new sort of umbrella culture that they're all part of, right? And so when they created this new culture, the Haudenosaunee, they asked, like, what are all the causes of violence that we've had? And what can we do to keep that violence from arising again? And so to give some examples, they noticed that a lot of the violence they had was conflicts due to hunting territory, right? People would want to go hunt in other nations' territory, and then the other nations wouldn't like that. And so they agreed that any hunter from any nation in the Confederacy could go into any other nation's territory. Boom. Done. Right? That problem just wouldn't happen again. And so another one was that they chose leaders in a way that ensured that the leaders always responded to the will of the people. And I won't go into it in this video to keep this video from being too long. Although in my book, One Disease, One Cure, I do go into it in a lot more detail to show how people can have leaders that actually respond to the will of the people. But they're, every candidate for a leadership role, for the chief role, in their representative council, goes through a huge number of checks. And my understanding is that anybody can give a veto and say, look, I don't want that person to be my leader. Women have a big role in it. They have a system that really makes sure their leaders reflect the will of the people, and that when their leaders aren't satisfying, they're kicked out. And so that is another way they were able to make sure that they could maintain a lasting peace, was by having leaders that were actually servants of the people. A third way was that they committed to never conquering another people, right? So they might go to war, and they did go to war from time to time, but they would never conquer the losers. Even if they won the war, they committed to themselves they would never impose taxes, they would never impose law, they would never impose religion on another people. And I believe they recognized that if they did that, they would become an unhealthy culture where a few people ruled over everybody else. And they didn't want that. They liked having a healthy culture, I believe. And they were able to maintain that. And I have a huge amount of respect for that, because when you think about it, the losers in a war, well, they just lost the war, right? They can't be like, hey, you promised not to conquer, right? So the losers could never hold the Haudenosaunee accountable to their own promise that they made as part of their founding. The Haudenosaunee had to hold themselves accountable to that promise in order to keep the kind of culture they wanted and not become unhealthy where they ruled over the losers in the war. So the Haudenosaunee still live to this day. They still live in that region. And they've actually maintained that deep peace amongst themselves for approximately 900 years. So what that shows me is that humans can learn from the past, right? They had big violence, they looked at the causes, they addressed the causes, and they created a lasting peace that has lasted for a very long time. So it's possible to learn from the past. Humans can do it. Why were the Haudenosaunee able to do that? Well, they were free to do so, right? Like, no one imposed law on them. They were free to look at their problems and figure out what to do about it. Why can't unhealthy cultures learn from the past? Well, you end up having a huge number of historians that will study the past and write their fancy history books. And what ends up happening? The same problems keep playing out because a few people rule over everybody else, and the rulers are the problem. Right? People in unhealthy cultures are not able to hold their rulers accountable. That's what allows them to be rulers. And so these same big problems just keep playing out. And so if people wanted to stop having wars based on lies, if people wanted to not have their peace activists called traitors, if people wanted to not have sexism or racism or these other things that every unhealthy culture has, they would need to address the root problem and have a culture where nobody rules over anybody else. And that ultimately is what my book is about. So if you're interested in learning more about what unhealthy cultures are like and what healthy cultures are like, how they maintain an economy that rewards generosity, how they choose leaders that actually serve the people, how they maintain a deep connection with the earth, and so many more things. If you'd like to learn more about healthy cultures and how those of us trapped in unhealthy cultures can generate a healthy culture, I welcome you to get your free copy of the book, One Disease, One Cure. It's available at onedisease-onecure.com.